"Can I play it for my mom?" she asked softly. Laughter filled the room. Cruel, careless, rich. But none of them knew the maid's daughter was about to change everything. "Can I play it for my mom?" That's what she asked. Just a little girl in a faded blue dress, at a party where her mother wasn't even allowed to stand still. It was supposed to be her mother's birthday, a quiet celebration that never came. Instead, the night became something else entirely. Behind the laughter of the rich and the glitter of the chandeliers, a secret waited. 10 small fingers, a heart full of music, and a courage no one saw coming. They thought she was just the maid's daughter, but they were about to hear the truth, one note at a time. And what started as a daughter's simple birthday gift ended as a moment that silenced a room. This is the story of how a maid's daughter made the giants listen, how a single note shattered a room built on power and changed everything. And before I forget, where are you watching from today? Leave a comment below. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Enjoy the story. She was a whisper in a world of roaring laughter, a secret no one was meant to see. From her hiding place behind a thick velvet curtain, she watched the giants in their glittering kingdom and wondered if they ever felt small. The Caldwell penthouse was a castle in the sky, perched on the 70th floor, with windows that swallowed the city lights below. Inside, the air was a rich mix of French perfume, roasted lamb, and the crisp smell of money. Crystal glasses chimed, a delicate music accompanying the hum of self-important conversation. Men in dark, tailored suits stood like oaks, their wives draped in jewels that shattered the chandelier light into 1,000 tiny rainbows. They were the city's architects of fortune, moving with the slow, certain grace of people who had never been denied a thing. Into this world of polished perfection, 10-year-old Chloe was a smudge. She was tucked away in a small alcove near the service corridor, her small body swallowed by the heavy, crimson curtain. Her mother had given her one simple instruction: stay quiet and stay hidden. Chloe was good at being quiet. She wore a simple blue dress, faded from countless washes, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. Her blonde hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, a few stray strands falling across a face that was all big, curious blue eyes. Those eyes missed nothing. They saw the faint sheen of sweat on the host's brow and the weary slump in her own mother's shoulders. Her mother, Susan, was a ghost of a different kind. She moved through the lavish party with practiced invisibility, a tray of canapes held perfectly level. She refilled empty glasses, cleared discarded plates, and offered polite, deferential smiles to people who looked right through her. Susan was a maid, a cleaner, a servant. Tonight, she was part of the catering staff, an extra pair of hands to ensure the seamless comfort of the city's elite. To Chloe, she was the whole world. She was the warm hands that brushed the hair from her face and the soft voice that sang her to sleep. Chloe watched her mother offer a plate of miniature quiches to a woman dripping with diamonds. The woman waved a dismissive hand, not even bothering to look at Susan. Susan's smile didn't falter, but Chloe saw the slight tremor in her hand as she turned away. A quiet anger, hot and sharp, pricked at Chloe's heart. She didn't understand these people, who had so much of everything they couldn't spare a single drop of kindness. The host of the evening was Harrison Caldwell. He was a tall, imposing man, perfectly fitted in a black tuxedo that seemed cut from shadow. His silver hair was impeccably styled, and his face was handsome but severe, with eyes that assessed and dismissed in the same cold glance. He was the king of this castle, and he ruled his kingdom with an iron will. He had built his real estate empire from the ground up and wielded its power like a scepter, believing his immense wealth was a reflection of his superior character. Chloe saw Mr. Caldwell corner her mother near the kitchen entrance. His voice was a low, cutting rumble, but in a momentary lull, the words carried. "Susan, that tray is nearly empty. Are you waiting for an invitation to refill it? My guests are not paying thousands of dollars to stare at bare silver." "Yes, Mr. Caldwell." "Right away," Susan murmured, her head bowed. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," he snapped. "And your uniform. There's a loose thread on your cuff. Do you have any idea how unprofessional that looks? I expect perfection. Is that understood?" "Yes, Mr. Caldwell." "I'm very sorry." Chloe's hands clenched into tight fists. She wanted to run out there, to stand in front of her mother and shout at the icy man. But she knew it would only make things worse. It would cost her mother this job, and they needed the money. So she stayed silent, the angry words locked behind her teeth, and watched her mother retreat into the kitchen, her shoulders a little more stooped than before. It was in that moment of helpless frustration that Chloe's eyes fell upon the room's true centerpiece. It wasn't the glittering chandelier or the panoramic view. It was the piano. It was a Steinway concert grand, a magnificent beast of polished ebony so black it seemed to hold the night sky in its reflection. It sat on a raised platform in the curve of the great window, a silent king waiting to speak. Its perfection was absolute. At home, in their cramped apartment, there was an old, beat-up upright piano from her grandmother. Half the keys were yellowed, and one always stuck, but Chloe loved it fiercely. It was her friend, the place where she could turn feelings she couldn't say out loud into something beautiful. Her great-grandfather, a war veteran she knew only from stories, had taught her grandmother to play. Chloe stared at the Steinway, mesmerized. She could almost feel the smooth, cool ivory under her fingertips. She could imagine its voice, not the tinny sound of her piano at home, but a voice that was rich, powerful, and pure. A voice that could fill this entire room and silence all the meaningless chatter. An hour passed. The party wore on, a slow dance of wealth and ego. Chloe's legs began to ache. Her mother had arranged for her to go home with another staff member, Mrs. Gable, at 10. But then she saw Harrison Caldwell stop her mother again. "I'm going to need you to stay late, Susan," he said, not a request but a command. "Someone has spilled wine on the Persian rug in the study. It needs to be attended to immediately. Then the kitchen needs a final deep clean." Susan's face fell, a flicker of disappointment, so brief only Chloe could have caught it. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, her voice hesitant. "My daughter is waiting, and tonight is—" "Is what?" he interrupted, his patience wearing thin. "This is more important. You'll be paid for the overtime." He turned and walked away, the matter settled. But Chloe knew what her mother had been about to say. Tonight was her mother's birthday. She was turning 35. A small, lopsided cupcake with a single candle was waiting for her in their refrigerator. That was to be their celebration. Now, her mother would be stuck here for hours, cleaning up after people who didn't even see her, on a day that was supposed to be hers. The injustice of it all swelled in Chloe's chest until she felt she might burst. She felt so small, so powerless. What gift could she possibly give her mother to make up for this spoiled evening? She had no money. She had nothing. Then, her eyes went back to the piano. It was a crazy idea. A terrifying, impossible idea. These people would laugh at her. They would be angry. But the thought took root, a tiny seed of defiance. Music was the only real thing she had. It was the one part of her that felt strong and true. Maybe, just maybe, it could be a gift. One song. A song for her mother, to let her know she was seen, that she was loved. Her heart started to hammer against her ribs. Her palms grew damp. She thought about her great-grandfather. They said he played the piano in the middle of a war, that his music gave tired soldiers strength. He had been brave. She had to be brave, too. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she pushed the heavy curtain aside and stepped out of the shadows. The sudden light was blinding. A few heads turned. Conversations faltered as people noticed the small, out-of-place child in the faded blue dress. Chloe kept her eyes down, her gaze fixed on the marble floor as she threaded her way through the maze of guests. Each step felt like a mile. She could feel their stares, their silent, questioning judgment. "Who was that child?" a woman whispered. "Must be one of the caterer's kids. She shouldn't be in here." Chloe ignored them. She saw a young man in a caterer's uniform standing near the piano. He looked kinder than the others, his face open and friendly. He was her best chance. She stopped in front of him, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She had to swallow twice before she could make her voice work. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely a squeak. The young man, whose name tag read David, looked down and gave her a small, surprised smile. "Hey there. Are you lost?" Chloe shook her head, her eyes darting toward the piano, and then to her mother, who was just emerging from the kitchen with a bucket and cleaning supplies, her face a mask of weary resignation. "No," Chloe said, finding a sliver of courage. She looked back at David, her blue eyes wide and imploring. "Please, can I play it for my mom? It's her birthday." David stared down at the little girl, his brow furrowed in confusion. The request was so absurd, so out of place in this environment of rigid rules and unspoken hierarchies, that for a moment he thought he must have misheard her. He glanced from Chloe's earnest, pleading face to the magnificent Steinway, then back again. A kid in a faded dress wanted to play a priceless instrument in the middle of a gala hosted by one of the city's most formidable men. It was a joke. It had to be. But the look in her eyes was no joke. It was a desperate, shining sincerity that caught him off guard. He saw her quick, worried glance towards her mother, who was now on her hands and knees by the far wall, preparing to tackle the wine stain on the expensive rug. He saw the bucket, the cleaning rags, the tired curve of Susan's back. It was her birthday. The words echoed in his head. A few of the guests closest to the piano had overheard. A woman with a tight, ageless face let out a short, sharp laugh, like the bark of a small dog. "Did you hear that, darling?" she said to the man beside her. "The maid's daughter wants to perform." The man, portly and red-faced, chuckled into his champagne flute. "A regular little prodigy, I'm sure. Perhaps she'll play chopsticks for us." The mockery was a splash of cold water, and David's spine stiffened. He was just a college kid working a catering gig to pay for his textbooks, but he knew cruelty when he saw it. He looked back down at Chloe, whose face had gone pale, her small flicker of bravery threatening to be extinguished by their contempt. I don't think that's a good idea," David whispered, his voice full of apology. "You could get in a lot of trouble. Your mom could get in trouble." "Please," Chloe whispered back, her voice trembling but resolute. "It's the only gift I have for her. I'll only play one song. I promise." Before David could answer, a shadow fell over them. Harrison Caldwell had noticed the disturbance, the small ripple in the smooth pond of his party, and had moved to correct it. His presence was immediately chilling. The air grew colder, the light seemed to dim. "What is going on here?" he asked, his voice low and dangerously calm. His cold eyes swept over David, dismissing him as insignificant, before landing on Chloe. His lips thinned into a line of profound disapproval. "What is this child doing out here? I thought I made it clear that the staff's families were not to be present." David's heart hammered in his chest. "Sir, she was just. I was not speaking to you." Caldwell cut him off without a glance. He directed his full, intimidating attention back to the 10-year-old girl. "You? Who are you?" Chloe shrank back, her courage failing under his icy stare. She couldn't find her voice. She could only stare at the polished black tips of his shoes. At that moment, Susan looked up from her work. Her eyes widened in horror as she saw her daughter standing before her powerful, unforgiving employer. A wave of pure panic washed over her. She scrambled to her feet, wiping her damp hands on her apron, and hurried across the floor, her steps clumsy with fear. "Chloe, what are you doing?" she cried, her voice strained. She reached her daughter and put a protective arm around her, pulling her close. "I am so sorry, Mr. Caldwell. So sorry. She was supposed to stay hidden. She didn't mean to disturb anyone. I'll take her home right now." She began to pull Chloe away, her grip tight with urgency. But Chloe resisted. She planted her worn-out sneakers firmly on the marble floor. "No, Mama," she said, her voice small but surprisingly firm. She looked up at her mother, her blue eyes shining with unshed tears. "It's for you. For your birthday." Susan's face crumpled. The mention of her birthday in this context was a new kind of humiliation. It was a private, humble thing, not something to be aired out in front of these people, especially not in front of this man. "Hush, baby, not now," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Let's just go." Harrison Caldwell watched the pathetic little scene with a look of utter distaste. He saw not a mother and daughter, but a breakdown in the proper order of things. He saw a mess that needed to be cleaned up. "She wants to play the piano, Mr. Caldwell," the red-faced man supplied with a malicious grin. "For her mother." A wave of derisive laughter rippled through the nearby guests. It was quiet, but it was sharp, and it cut Chloe to the bone. They were laughing at her. They were laughing at her mother. They were laughing at the very idea that a gift from someone like her could have any value in a place like this. Caldwell's gaze drifted to the Steinway, and then back to Chloe. A cruel, condescending smirk touched his lips. "The piano? Don't be ridiculous. That is a $190,000 concert instrument, not a toy for a servant's child to bang on." He leaned down slightly, bringing his face closer to Chloe's, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, mocking whisper. Go home and play with your dolls. This is a world for adults. The insult was not just to her, but to her mother, to their life, to everything they were. And in that moment, something inside Chloe snapped. The fear, the anger, the helpless frustration, it all coalesced into a single point of fiery defiance. The stories of her great-grandfather, the war veteran, flashed through her mind. He hadn't been afraid. He had faced down cannons and guns. She was only facing a man in a tuxedo. She pulled away from her mother's grasp. She lifted her chin and looked Harrison Caldwell directly in the eye. The timid, frightened child was gone. In her place was someone he had never seen before. My great-grandfather was Sergeant James Miller of the 101st Airborne, she said, her voice ringing with a sudden, startling clarity that silenced the nearby whispers. He received the Silver Star at Normandy. He said that music wasn't a toy. He said it was a weapon against the darkness. And he said that a person's worth isn't measured by how much money they have, but by what's in their heart. A stunned silence fell over the small crowd. They had expected tears, not a history lesson. They had expected a child's retreat, not a soldier's stand. Harrison Caldwell was so taken aback that for a second, he was speechless. His smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of disbelief, and then a deep, simmering anger. Who was this little girl to lecture him? Susan stared at her daughter, her heart caught somewhere between terror and a fierce, swelling pride. She had never heard Chloe speak like that. She had never seen that fire in her eyes. Chloe didn't wait for a response. She saw the opening, the momentary crack in the wall of their arrogance, and she took it. She turned away from Caldwell and walked the few remaining steps to the piano bench. The polished ebony was cool and solid beneath her small hands. It felt like an anchor in a storm. Get away from that piano, Caldwell finally snarled, recovering his voice. He took a step forward, his hand raised to grab her. But David, the young caterer, moved. It was a small, almost imperceptible action. He shifted his weight as he was picking up an empty tray, placing himself just slightly in Caldwell's path. It wasn't a barricade, but it was enough to make the older man alter his course, to break his stride for a fraction of a second. It was a tiny act of rebellion, a silent vote of support from an unlikely ally. That fraction of a second was all Chloe needed. She slid onto the smooth, leather bench. It was a little high, but she could reach the pedals if she stretched. The 88 keys lay before her like a path, a stark and simple promise of black and white in a room full of confusing, ugly shades of gray. Her hands, small and trembling slightly, hovered over the ivory. She took one last, deep breath, shutting out the angry hiss of Mr. Caldwell's voice, the horrified gasp of her mother, and the curious, mocking stares of the giants in their glittering kingdom. She closed her eyes and thought of her mother's tired face. Then, she played the first note. It was not loud. It was a single, perfect C-sharp, played with a gentle, loving touch. But in the ringing silence that had fallen over the room, it sounded as clear and as powerful as a cathedral bell. The note hung in the air, a perfect, crystalline thing, and in that one sound, the entire world of the party, the clinking glasses, the empty laughter, the cruel whispers, seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The story was just beginning. That first note was followed by a second, then a third. They were not the hesitant, clumsy notes of a child showing off a half-learned party piece. They were notes of impossible grace and precision, strung together to form the opening bars of a melody so profound, so full of a sorrowful, aching beauty, that it seemed to physically alter the air in the room. Chloe was playing Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor. It was a piece written from a place of deep longing and fierce, patriotic pain, a song of a lost home. And from the hands of a 10-year-old girl in a faded blue dress, it was a miracle. Her small fingers, which her mother had only ever seen struggling with buttons or gripping a pencil, flew across the keys with a speed and confidence that was breathtaking. They danced and leapt, cascaded and whispered. She played not just the notes, but the silence between them. The music filled the vast penthouse, pouring into every corner, silencing every conversation. The clinking of glasses stopped. The rustle of silk dresses ceased. All of it was swallowed by the sound emanating from the grand piano, a sound that was at once heartbreakingly delicate and shatteringly powerful. The red-faced man who had joked about chopsticks now stood with his mouth slightly agape, his champagne flute forgotten in his hand. The woman who had laughed at the maid's daughter clutched the arm of her companion, her painted-on smile gone, replaced by a mask of slack-jawed astonishment. They were connoisseurs of expensive things, and while most of them knew little about music, they knew enough to recognize that what they were hearing was extraordinary. This was not a child's recital. This was art. Harrison Caldwell was frozen in place, his hands still half raised. His mind, a sharp and efficient machine trained to calculate profit margins and hostile takeovers, struggled to process the data it was receiving. The source of the sound, this small, defiant child, was completely at odds with its quality. He had dismissed her as an insignificant nuisance, a bit of social untidiness to be swept away. But the music she was creating was a thing of immense value. It was complex, sophisticated, and emotionally devastating. It was a language he did not speak, but he could feel its power, and it infuriated and mystified him in equal measure. He was a man who owned masterpieces, but he had never witnessed one being born. But the most profound transformation was happening in Susan. As the first wave of melody washed over her, her fear began to recede, replaced by a disbelieving awe. She knew Chloe played the piano. She had encouraged it, saving what little money she could for lessons with a kindly old woman in their neighborhood. She had heard her daughter practice for hours on their old, out-of-tune upright, the muffled notes a familiar soundtrack to their quiet life. She thought she knew her daughter's talent. She knew nothing. What she was hearing now was not the music of a student. It was the music of a master. The depth of emotion Chloe was wringing from the instrument, the rage, the sorrow, the fleeting moments of transcendent hope, was far beyond the emotional capacity of a 10-year-old. It was as if Chloe had tapped into some deep, ancient well of human experience. Where had this come from? How had this incredible, powerful gift been hiding inside her quiet, unassuming little girl? Susan sank into a nearby chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Tears began to stream down her face, but they were not tears of fear or humiliation. They were tears of a pride so immense, so overwhelming, that it felt like her heart would burst. She was seeing her daughter for the first time, not as the child she needed to protect, but as the incredible, luminous being she truly was. The world had tried to make them both small, to define them by their poverty and their position. But in that moment, her daughter was the biggest thing in the room. Her music was a roar that drowned out all the giants. The piece moved into its tumultuous middle section. The tempo quickened, the notes becoming a furious, passionate storm. Chloe's body swayed with the music, her ponytail swinging like a metronome. She was no longer just playing the piano, she was commanding it. The Steinway, which had seemed so imposing and untouchable, was now an extension of her own small body, an amplifier for the gigantic feelings raging within her. The music spoke of her anger at Mr. Caldwell, of her frustration at their poverty, of her fierce, protective love for her mother. It was a tempest of emotion, rendered with flawless, terrifying technical skill. A few of the guests, recovering from their initial shock, began to whisper, "Who is she? I've never heard anything like it." An elderly gentleman with a kind face and watery eyes, who had been sitting quietly in a corner all evening, leaned towards his wife. "That's the posthumous nocturne," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I've heard it played at Carnegie Hall. Never like this. Never with such honesty." His name was Mr. Abernathy, a quiet philanthropist and a lifelong patron of the arts. He had donated millions to the city's symphony, but his face held a look of reverence he usually reserved for seasoned maestros, not unknown children. David, the young caterer, stood near the wall, a tray of empty glasses balanced in his hands. He had forgotten completely about his duties. He watched Chloe, a huge, goofy grin spreading across his face. He had been the gatekeeper. He had been her one small chance, the person who hadn't immediately said no. And he felt a ridiculous, bubbling sense of pride, as if he had somehow discovered this hidden treasure himself. He caught Susan's eye across the room and gave her a small, encouraging nod. She returned it with a watery, grateful smile. The storm of the music began to subside. The furious cascade of notes softened, returning to the haunting, lyrical melody of the beginning. It was the sound of a sunrise after a long, dark night. It was the sound of tears drying. It was a promise that even after the deepest sorrow, there could be peace. Chloe's touch on the keys became impossibly gentle, each note a soft, falling star. The final chords hung in the air, shimmering, before fading slowly into a perfect, profound silence. For a full 10 seconds after the last note died away, the room was utterly still. No one moved. No one breathed. The silence was more powerful than any applause. It was a shared, sacred space that Chloe had created, a moment of pure, unadulterated truth in a room built on artifice. Then, Mr. Abernathy, the elderly philanthropist, rose slowly to his feet. He began to clap. His applause was not the polite, rhythmic clapping of a society gala. It was loud, heartfelt, and genuine. A moment later, his wife joined him. Then, another guest, and another. Within seconds, the entire room, this collection of the city's most cynical and powerful people, erupted in a thunderous, standing ovation. The applause was a physical force, a wave of sound that washed over Chloe. She opened her eyes, looking out from the shelter of the piano. She seemed dazed, as if waking from a dream. She saw the faces of the guests, no longer mocking or dismissive, but filled with a stunned, unadulterated admiration. She saw Mr. Caldwell, his face a complex mask of shock and grudging respect. And she saw her mother, her face shining with tears and a love so powerful it was the only thing that felt real in the entire, glittering room. Chloe slid off the piano bench. The applause continued to roar around her. She had wanted to give her mother a gift. She had wanted to play her a song. She had not expected this. She had not expected to stop the world. The applause, which had been a roaring ocean, slowly receded, leaving behind a shore of hushed, reverent whispers. The guests, still on their feet, looked at the small girl by the piano as if she were an apparition. They had come tonight expecting to see and be seen, to engage in the familiar rituals of their class. They had not expected to bear witness to a moment of genuine, unvarnished genius. Chloe, caught in the eye of this strange, silent storm, took a hesitant step back towards her mother. It was the instinct of a child seeking safety after a great and terrifying leap. The music had been a shield, a world she could control. Now, without it, she was just a 10-year-old girl again, standing in a room full of strangers, her worn-out sneakers a stark contrast to the sea of designer heels and polished leather. Susan rushed forward and wrapped her arms around her daughter, burying her face in Chloe's blonde hair. "Oh, baby," she whispered, her voice choked with a mix of pride, relief, and a lingering, bone-deep fear. You were incredible." Chloe hugged her back tightly, clinging to the familiar scent of laundry soap and her mother's quiet strength. "Happy birthday, Mama," she murmured into her shoulder. It was Harrison Caldwell who finally broke the spell. The applause had been a public referendum on his judgment, and he had lost. His face was a thunderous mask of controlled fury. He had been made a fool of in his own home, his authority completely undermined by a child. His carefully curated evening had been hijacked. He strode forward, his steps sharp and angry on the marble floor. The whispers died instantly as he approached the mother and daughter. "That was quite a performance," he said, the words clipped and cold. There was no warmth in his tone, only the icy chill of a man reasserting his control. "But this is a private event, not a stage for auditions. Susan, I believe I gave you a task to complete." The threat was clear and vicious. He was reminding Susan of her place, reminding her that despite the applause, she was still the help. She was the maid who was supposed to be cleaning his rug, not the mother of a prodigy. Fear, cold and familiar, shot through Susan. For a moment, she had forgotten who and where they were. Caldwell was reminding them with brutal efficiency. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell," Susan said, her voice trembling as she straightened up, pulling Chloe behind her as if to shield her from his venom. "I'm sorry, sir. We'll go." But before she could retreat, another voice, calm and authoritative, cut through the tension. "I should hope she doesn't go anywhere." All heads turned. Mr. Abernathy, the elderly gentleman who had started the applause, stepped forward. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of old money and an even older sense of decency. He was not as physically imposing as Caldwell, but his presence carried a different kind of weight, one of quiet, unimpeachable integrity. He stopped beside Chloe, placing a gentle, reassuring hand on her shoulder. He smiled down at her, his watery eyes full of a genuine, grandfatherly kindness. "That was the most moving rendition of that piece I have ever heard, young lady," he said, his voice soft but resonant. "What is your name?" "Chloe, sir," she whispered, intimidated by this new attention. "Well, Chloe," he said, still smiling, "you have a remarkable gift. A truly remarkable gift." He then turned his gaze to Harrison Caldwell, and the warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cool, appraising look. "Harrison, you have a future virtuoso, a genuine prodigy, playing a $190,000 piano in your living room, and your first instinct is to send her back to the scullery? Forgive me, but that seems a rather stunning failure to recognize true value." The rebuke was delivered in the polite, measured tones of their social class, but it was as sharp and effective as a slap in the face. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Abernathy was one of the few men in the city whose social and financial standing rivaled his own. He was also the head of the board of the very charity for which this gala was being held. Caldwell could not dismiss him as he had dismissed everyone else. "William," Caldwell said, forcing a tight, unpleasant smile, "I appreciate the music as much as anyone. But there is a time and a place. This is a private residence." "Nonsense," Abernathy said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "This is a party, and this young lady has just given your guests a far greater gift than any of your overpriced catering. You should be thanking her." He looked back at Chloe and her mother. "Ma'am," he said to Susan, his tone respectful, "your daughter is extraordinary. Has she had formal training?" Susan, flustered and overwhelmed, could only stammer, "A little. Mrs. Peterson, in our building, she gives lessons." Abernathy nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I see. And you, Chloe? Is this what you want to do? Do you love to play?" Chloe looked from the kind old man to her mother's worried face, and then at the magnificent piano. She thought of the joy she felt when her fingers found the right chords, the way the music could say all the things she couldn't. "More than anything," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "I thought so," Abernathy said with a satisfied nod. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and produced a slim, elegant business card. He offered it to Susan. "My name is William Abernathy. I am the chairman of the board for the Juilliard School. I would like to arrange for an audition for your daughter. A full scholarship, of course. We have a pre-college division. She would study with the best instructors in the world." The room erupted in a fresh wave of murmurs. The Juilliard School. A full scholarship. The offer was so momentous, so life-altering, that it seemed to hang in the air like a tangible thing. It was a golden key, a sudden, impossible escape from a life of scrubbing other people's floors. Susan stared at the card in her hand, as if it might burn her. Her mind couldn't process it. 1 minute, she was worried about losing her job over a spilled glass of wine. The next, she was being offered a future for her daughter that she had never, in her wildest dreams, dared to imagine. Tears welled in her eyes again. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say yes," Abernathy said gently. For Harrison Caldwell, this was the final, unforgivable humiliation. Not only had he been upstaged, not only had he been publicly rebuked, but now his party was being used as a backdrop for this fairy tale discovery. Abernathy was anointing this child, this nobody, right here on his Persian rug. It was a complete and total usurpation of his authority. "This is hardly the venue for such arrangements, William," Caldwell said, his voice dangerously low. He took a step closer, trying to reclaim the center of attention. He looked down at Chloe, a cruel, calculating glint in his eyes. He decided that if he couldn't intimidate her, he would try to purchase her. "The girl has talent, I'll grant you that," he said, adopting a tone of magnanimous patronage. "In fact, I'm feeling generous tonight. I'll match your offer, William. My own family foundation will cover her expenses. She can attend any music school she chooses. There's no need to make this a public spectacle." It was a blatant power play. He was trying to co-opt Chloe's success, to turn her into one of his charitable acquisitions, another jewel in his philanthropic crown. He wanted to own her story. But Chloe looked at him, at his cold eyes and his false, possessive smile, and she was not tempted. She had seen the way he treated her mother. She had felt the sting of his contempt. She knew that his offer was not a gift, but a cage. She took her mother's hand, her small fingers curling around Susan's. "Thank you, sir," she said, looking not at Caldwell, but at the kind old man who had seen her, not as a nuisance or an opportunity, but as a person. "We'll call you Mr. Abernathy." The choice was made. The rejection was absolute. In that quiet, simple sentence, a 10-year-old girl had publicly spurned the offer of one of the most powerful men in the city in favor of another. She had chosen kindness over power. The slight was so profound, so complete, that for a moment, Harrison Caldwell's mask of civility cracked, and a look of pure, unadulterated rage flashed in his eyes. The story was no longer about a little girl who played the piano. It was about a battle of wills, a clash of two worlds played out in the heart of a glittering penthouse. And the maid's daughter, armed with nothing but her talent and her integrity, was winning. The silence that followed Chloe's choice was brittle and sharp. Harrison Caldwell's face, which had been a mask of public civility, finally broke. The rage he had been suppressing now burned freely in his eyes. He had been dismissed, publicly, in his own home, by the daughter of his maid. The humiliation was a poison, and it needed a victim. His gaze shifted from Chloe and landed, with crushing weight, on Susan. "I see," he said, his voice a low snarl, stripped of all pretense. "You've raised a very ambitious daughter, Susan. It seems her lessons have extended beyond the piano." He took a deliberate step towards her, invading her personal space, forcing her to look at him. "You are finished here. Not just tonight. You're fired. I'll also be making a few calls. I imagine by morning, you'll find it very difficult to find work cleaning toilets anywhere in this city." It was a cruel, vindictive blow, aimed at the most vulnerable point, their survival. Susan flinched as if he had physically struck her. The hope that had blossomed in her chest moments before withered into icy terror. The scholarship, the bright future, it all meant nothing if they were going to be homeless tomorrow. This was the power Caldwell wielded. Not just the power to give, but the power to take everything away. "Mama," Chloe's small voice trembled. She clutched her mother's hand, feeling the sudden, violent tremor of her fear. But before Susan could capitulate, before she could beg for a job she now despised, William Abernathy stepped between her and Caldwell. He was an old man, and shorter than the formidable real estate magnate, but he planted himself like a rock against a storm. "That's quite enough, Harrison," Abernathy said, his voice ringing with an authority that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with character. "Are you really so fragile that your ego can be shattered by a 10-year-old girl with integrity? You threaten this woman's livelihood because her daughter wouldn't let you purchase her soul? Have you no decency at all?" "This is a private matter between me and my employee," Caldwell shot back, his face darkening with fury. "It has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me," Abernathy countered, his voice rising for the first time. "It has everything to do with everyone in this room who is here tonight to support a charity. We are here, ostensibly, to help the less fortunate, and you are threatening to ruin a woman's life over a perceived slight. It's monstrous, and it's hypocritical." He turned to address the silent, watching guests. "Tell me," he said, his voice resonating through the room, "is this what we stand for? Do we applaud a child's genius one moment, and then stand by silently while the powerful man she embarrassed tries to crush her family? Is that who we are?" A nervous murmur went through the crowd. They were caught. Abernathy had turned the tables, transforming a private dispute into a public test of character. They were all complicit now, either by their silence or their support. A woman in a sapphire dress, who had been watching the scene with wide, compassionate eyes, spoke up. "He's right, Harrison. This is unbecoming. Let the woman be." Another man called out from the back. "She's done nothing wrong." The tide was turning. The silent admiration for Chloe's talent was now becoming vocal support for her and her mother. The guests were not a monolith. While many were sycophants of power, others had been moved, first by the music and now by the blatant injustice. They saw the conflict for what it was, a bully trying to punish a child for being brave. Caldwell looked around the room, at the faces of his guests, and saw that he had lost them. He had overplayed his hand. His attempt to reassert his dominance had only exposed his cruelty, making him look petty and vindictive. He was isolated, his anger turning to a sour, impotent rage. He shot one last look of pure hatred at Susan and Chloe, a look that promised a longer, quieter, more patient revenge. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and strode out of the main ballroom. his rigid back a testament to his fury. The king had been dethroned in his own castle. As soon as he was gone, the tension in the room broke. Several guests approached Susan and Chloe, offering words of encouragement and admiration. The woman in the sapphire dress, who introduced herself as Mrs. Miller, pressed a folded handkerchief into Susan's hand. "Your daughter is a treasure," she said, her voice warm. "Don't you let anyone tell you otherwise." David, the young caterer, approached with 2 glasses of water on a small tray. He offered one to Susan and one to Chloe. His face was beaming. "That was the coolest thing I have ever seen in my entire life," he said to Chloe with a wide, conspiratorial grin. Susan, still trembling with the aftershock of the confrontation, could hardly speak. She was overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of fortune, by the kindness of these strangers who, only an hour ago, had been part of an intimidating and faceless elite. She looked at Mr. Abernathy, her eyes swimming with gratitude. "Sir," she began, her voice cracking, "I thank you. You didn't have to do that." "Nonsense," he said, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "Decency is not an optional accessory, my dear. It's the price of admission for being a human being. Harrison has forgotten that." He looked down at Chloe, who was sipping her water, her big blue eyes still wide with the enormity of the evening's events. "Now then," he said, his tone shifting from confrontational to cheerfully practical. "I believe this young lady has earned more than just a scholarship. She's earned a proper birthday celebration for her mother." He clapped his hands together. "David, my boy," he said to the caterer, "be a good chap and find the best cake in that kitchen. And bring it here. We have a birthday to celebrate." A half-hour later, the atmosphere in the penthouse had been completely transformed. The stuffy, formal gala had dissolved into a genuine, impromptu celebration. The remaining guests, the ones who had stayed not out of obligation but out of a newfound sense of community, gathered around the grand piano. David had emerged from the kitchen not with a single slice, but with a magnificent multi-layered chocolate cake, originally intended for Caldwell's private dessert. He had, with a touch of theatrical flair, lit a single candle he'd found and placed it in the center. They all sang happy birthday to Susan. Her initial embarrassment was quickly washed away by the sheer, improbable joy of the moment. Her face, which had been etched with worry for so long, was now soft and luminous in the candlelight. She stood with her arm around Chloe, surrounded by the warm voices of her new, unlikely friends. When the song was over, she closed her eyes, made a silent, heartfelt wish, and blew out the candle. As David cut the cake, Mr. Abernathy sat down with Susan and Chloe on a plush sofa. He explained the details of the Juilliard program, answering Susan's hesitant questions with patience and clarity. He spoke of schedules and instructors, of dormitories and recitals. He painted a picture of a future so bright and so full of promise that it seemed like a dream. "But sir," Susan said, a line of worry creasing her brow, "we can't afford to live in New York. The scholarship, it's wonderful, but the cost of the city." Abernathy smiled. "That has all been taken care of," he said simply. "My wife and I maintain a small foundation for exceptionally gifted young artists. It provides for housing, living expenses, and any other needs that may arise. All we ask is that Chloe works hard and never forgets the love of the music that brought her here." He looked at Chloe, "and that she plays for an old man from time to time." The generosity was staggering. It was a complete, life-altering gift, offered with no strings attached. Susan could only shake her head, the tears finally flowing freely, tears of gratitude so profound there were no words for them. Chloe, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Abernathy?" "Of course, my dear. Why are you doing this for us?" The old man was silent for a moment, his gaze drifting to the city lights beyond the vast window. "My wife and I had a son," he said, his voice soft with memory. "He was a musician, a cellist. He was brilliant, passionate, very much like you. He died very young. For a long time after he was gone, the music died in our house too. It was too painful to listen to. But helping young people like you, it feels like we are keeping a part of his song alive in the world." He looked back at Chloe, and his smile was a little sad, but deeply kind. "You reminded me of him tonight. You have the same fire, the same truth in your heart." The evening was drawing to a close. The guests began to depart, leaving with a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. David helped Susan pack up a large piece of cake to take home. Mr. Abernathy arranged for his personal driver to take Susan and Chloe home, promising to call in the morning to begin the formal arrangements. As they stood by the elevator, ready to leave the glittering castle in the sky, Chloe looked back one last time at the grand piano. It stood silent in the now quiet room, its polished ebony surface reflecting the soft lights. It was just an object, a thing of wood and wire and ivory. But tonight, it had been her voice. It had been her weapon. It had been her key to a whole new world. Her mother squeezed her hand, her heart too full to speak. They stepped into the elevator, and as the doors slid shut, they left the world of Harrison Caldwell behind forever, descending back towards the city, towards their small apartment, but on a path that led to a future that was now unbound and filled with music. The ride home was a silent, dreamlike journey. Chloe and her mother sat in the back of Mr. Abernathy's limousine, a car so spacious and quiet it felt like a private room gliding through the city. The seats were made of soft, cream-colored leather that sighed when they sat down, a sound of impossible luxury. Outside, the city lights streaked past the tinted windows, a blurry river of gold and red and white. It was the same city they lived in every day, but seen from this new vantage point, it looked like a place of magic and promise. Susan held Chloe's hand, her thumb stroking the back of her daughter's knuckles. Her mind was a whirlwind, replaying the evening's events in a dizzying loop. Harrison Caldwell's sneering face, the terrifying threat of ruin, the impossible, beautiful sound of her daughter's music, the thunder of applause, the quiet, firm kindness in William Abernathy's eyes. It felt less like a memory and more like a scene from a movie she had watched, a fairy tale that had somehow swallowed them whole. She looked at the elegant box on the seat beside her, the one containing the slice of rich chocolate cake, and it seemed like the only piece of tangible evidence that any of it had been real. Chloe leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, her small body finally succumbing to the exhaustion of the long, emotional night. But her mind was still wide awake, her thoughts buzzing. She thought about the weight of the piano keys under her fingers, the way the music had poured out of her like a language she hadn't known she could speak so fluently. For the first time in her life, she hadn't felt small or invisible. She had felt powerful. She had made the giants listen. She wondered if this was how her great-grandfather had felt, not with a piano, but with his courage, standing firm in the face of something huge and terrifying. The car slowed, turning off the wide, brightly lit avenue onto a quieter, more familiar street. It glided to a stop in front of their apartment building, a modest, 5-story brick structure that looked humbled and small in the glare of the limousine's headlights. Their home. It had always been a refuge, but tonight, the contrast between this simple building and the glass tower they had just left was staggering. The driver, a man with a kind, discreet smile, came around to open the door for them. "Have a good night, ma'am, miss," he said, his voice a respectful murmur. "Thank you," Susan said, her voice still shaky. She took the cake box, and she and Chloe stepped out onto the familiar cracked pavement. They watched as the long, black car pulled away from the curb, its red taillights disappearing around the corner, leaving them in the quiet dark of their own neighborhood. The magic carriage had returned them home. They climbed the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, their footsteps echoing in the silent building. Susan unlocked the door, and they stepped inside. The air in their small, 2-bedroom apartment was warm and still. It smelled of home, of lemon-scented cleaner, of the soup Susan had made for dinner, of old books and Chloe's faint, chalky scent from her piano keys. Everything was exactly as they had left it. The worn-out sofa with the slightly frayed armchair, the small kitchen table with its 2 mismatched chairs, the framed photos on the wall of grandparents, and of a younger Susan holding a baby Chloe. It was a world away from the Caldwell penthouse. There were no chandeliers, no marble floors, no priceless works of art. But there was a different kind of wealth here, the quiet, deep, unshakable wealth of love. Susan placed the cake box on the kitchen table and then sank onto one of the chairs, the last of her adrenaline finally draining away, leaving her feeling boneless and weak. Chloe sat opposite her, her small feet dangling a few inches from the floor. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the immensity of what had happened finally beginning to sink in. "Juilliard," Susan whispered, the words sounding foreign and holy in her small kitchen. She reached into the pocket of her simple black uniform and pulled out the business card Mr. Abernathy had given her. It was thick and white, the lettering a crisp, embossed black. It felt heavy in her hand, like the deed to a new life. William Abernathy, Chairman of the Board, the Juilliard School. President, the Abernathy Foundation for the Arts. And beneath that, a phone number and an address on Park Avenue. Susan traced the letters of his name with her fingertip. Then she turned the card over. There was a small, handwritten note on the back, in elegant, sloping cursive. P.S. It read, "Please give my warmest regards to your grandmother, Eleanor. Her father was the bravest man I ever knew. He once played the piano for my platoon on a cold night in Bastogne and made us all feel human again. I've been in his debt ever since. W.A." Susan read the note once, then twice. Her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted from the words to Chloe's face, her mind struggling to connect the pieces. Eleanor, her mother's name. Her father, Sergeant James Miller. Bastogne. He once played the piano for my platoon. Oh my God, Susan breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. The card trembled in her other hand. Chloe, listen to this. She read the note out loud, her voice thick with wonder and disbelief. Chloe's eyes grew wider with every word. The story she had known her whole life, the legend of her great-grandfather, the piano-playing war hero, had suddenly crashed into their present. It wasn't just a story. It was a connection. It was a debt. William Abernathy wasn't a random benefactor, a kind stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. He was one of the soldiers. He was one of the men her great-grandfather had played for, one of the lives he had touched with his music in the middle of a war, decades ago, an ocean away. The twist was so profound, so utterly perfect, that it felt like the universe itself had conspired to write it. The legacy of a brave man's kindness had been a seed, planted in the frozen mud of a battlefield, and it had lain dormant for 2 generations, waiting for this one night, waiting for his great-granddaughter to be brave in her own way, to finally bring it to bloom. The tears that came to Susan's eyes now were not of fear or even of gratitude. They were tears of connection, of understanding that their lives were part of a much larger, more beautiful story than she had ever known. Her grandfather's courage had not died with him. It had been passed down, a silent inheritance, and it had saved them tonight. Harrison Caldwell thought the world ran on money and power. He thought a person's worth could be written on a balance sheet. He was wrong. The world ran on these invisible threads of kindness and courage. It ran on the echoes of songs played in the darkness. That was the real power. That was the real wealth. Chloe finally understood. Her great-grandfather's gift wasn't just the music. It was the bravery to share it when it was needed most. A small smile touched her lips. She stood up, went to the refrigerator, and took out the small, lopsided cupcake with the single, unlit candle. She brought it to the table and set it down next to the decadent, multi-layered cake from the penthouse. The two sat side by side, one a symbol of immense wealth, the other a symbol of humble love. Both were part of their story now. Susan looked at the cupcake, then at Chloe, and she started to laugh. It was a quiet, watery laugh at first, and then it grew, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy and release. She laughed until tears streamed down her cheeks, washing away the last traces of the evening's fear. She lit the single candle with a match from the stove. The tiny flame flickered, casting a warm, gentle glow on their faces. It wasn't the glittering light of a chandelier, but it was enough. It was everything. "Happy birthday, Mama," Chloe said again, her voice soft in the quiet of their kitchen. "Thank you, my little songbird," Susan whispered back, reaching across the table to brush the hair from her daughter's forehead. They didn't eat the fancy cake. They shared the cupcake. They sat there in their small, safe kitchen, in the heart of the vast, sleeping city, and they shared their own small, perfect celebration. From their window, the lights of the distant skyscrapers looked like a field of scattered diamonds. It was a world they had once only looked at from afar. Now, they knew they didn't have to live in its castles to be queens. They just had to remember the music that was in their hearts, and the unbreakable strength of the song they had made together. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down? Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comments section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.